Hello there, and welcome to this new podcast on all things coaching in higher education. My name is Tim Jansa. I'm an organizational leadership and development coach, and I'll be your host for this series. My first guest is a dear friend and former colleague of mine, Dr. Kavita Pandit. Kavita has made a name for herself as an outstanding executive leadership coach at colleges and universities across the country. So I asked her to join us today, not only because of her wealth of experience as an executive level coach, but also to provide us with some insights into her journey as a coach, the evolution of coaching as a developmental tool at colleges and universities, and also how she approaches working with administrators and their specific challenges. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, Kavita, and I'm so glad you're here.
Hello, Tim. I'm so pleased to be here. We've known each other for many years now, and I really admire your work that you're doing in this whole higher ed coaching, organizational change space. Congratulations on this new video podcast series, and I'm delighted to be part of it.
Thank you so much, Kavita. I couldn't imagine having anybody else on here for one of the first episodes. So, Kavita, when you and I first discussed our topic for today, you very quickly honed in on a very specific subset of coaching clients in higher ed, which is academic leaders, especially at the executive level. Why did you choose that focus, and how does coaching academic leaders differ from coaching non-academic ones?
That's a great question. Let me just back up by sharing what I mean by academic and non academic leaders. By academic leaders, I'm referring to those individuals that typically begin their leadership journey as members of faculty with a strong identity in a particular discipline, doing teaching and research, and then move into management positions such as department chair, dean, and so forth. This is in contrast to those university leaders that may not have begun their careers as in teaching and research, but may go on into more senior roles. One of the interesting features of those that begin in faculty as faculty members or are faculty members is that they have a very strong allegiance to their discipline. In fact, I've heard faculty world often being referred to as a guild, whether where their strong connections are with their discipline writ large across the country or the world, and much less so with their institution. So when faculty move into university formal leadership as a department chair is often the first step, they they often struggle with these dueling identities, one as a colleague, as part of this academic disciplinary community, versus being part of an organization with some kind of an authority and supervisory skill. And of course, I have my career started as a faculty and went through the ranks, and in a curious way, backed into coaching after years of being a mentor and supervisor. The last stages of my career were as an internal coach at a university. So this is a space I enjoy and feel I can contribute to.
Right. So, Kavita, thank you so much for sharing that and for explaining the difference there. It's really fascinating that you brought up identity because this is something, I've been writing a lot about, and it's something that really creates sometimes a big challenge for coaches because when you're trying to change somebody whose identity is so um, tied into their academic achievement and their degrees and publications and all these kind of things, it's tough to break through that and help them uh, maybe pivot a little bit or flex a little bit because again you're talking about identity in this particular case. Have you experienced that as well?
I have, and indeed, sometimes, as a department chair, I've had to struggle leaving my academic role behind. But if I can, from in my coaching world, where I see this the most play out is faculty leaders starting in faculty. Faculty are trained to be very analytical and often
Hmm.
critical in their thinking. They like to analyze, they like the data. And this certainly is a useful trait in leadership because it allows them to better troubleshoot issues and conduct strategic planning. So it's certainly a positive. Yet, on the flip side, I find that sometimes or often faculty have forgotten how to access what I would call the innate intelligence, their gut, their instinct, their heart. What does this feel like? And because of this, they are not always working with the full data available to them. And I'll give you a quick example of a client of mine who she was a senior administrator and was looking to move and had two job offers. And she came to me and was trying to figure out which one to take. And I asked her to share a little bit about each, and she did. The first one was another academic position. The second one was a outside industry position. And as she talked about it, I could see she was, talking in very spreadsheet terms, pros and cons of each. Yet, as she talked about one, she was very, her appearance was very, yes, this is a strong thing. This will be good for me. When she spoke about the other, I saw her eyes light up and, sharing much more detail, much more animatedly. And when she was done sharing this, I simply reflected back. I said, it was interesting to me to see when you talked about this, your face was still, you were very in your thought process. And then the other one, there was a lot more energy. And it made her realize, oh, really? And so that was one example of how that was not being accessed during her thing. So in my coaching of academic leaders, I really invite them to access their innate intelligence instead of simply their prefrontal cortex and collect all the data that might help them make the best decision. Observe your physical sensations. Sometimes I'll use poetry to help
Hmm.
them access that emotional core, which they've so often learned to stamp down. In fact, just to wrap it up, one of my clients, when I asked him about, uh, you know, what did you feel like? He says, well, that's subjective. I just want to stay with the objective. And that's a classic example of how academics may approach their decision making.
I really appreciate you sharing this. There's just so many things to unpack here. The first of all, I love how you kind of demonstrated really high level expert coaching by also looking at a client's body language, the way they react when they talk about something. This is something that I think, younger or not younger, but less experienced coaches definitely uh, don't take into account a lot of times, but the client's body language just tells you so much.
Yes.
And I could see how in higher ed in particular, it's almost like flipping a switch sometimes. Because on one hand, you mentioned that this very it's all prefrontal cortex, and thanks for bringing in the neuroscience of coaching too. It's very just logic based. It's this hypercriticality that also a lot of faculty grow up with in the early stages of their
Yes.
career, because I mean it's about their degree, it's about their dissertation, their research, publications, conference presentations, all these things. And they're just used to kind of taking things apart. However, that doesn't necessarily make a good leader down the road. Where, as you said, this internal this gut feeling, letting your subjective self come out and be more compassionate, more empathizing. That is, I think, something that is so difficult
Yeah.
for a lot of leaders to bring out. So, you mentioned earlier this, and you've already touched on this idea of allegiance to the institution versus their discipline, or rather, to the discipline versus the institution. Um, and the idea of loyalty, especially, since COVID, I mean, a lot of things have changed there.
Yes.
I'm reading a great book, which I just bought. It just came out. It's called The Caring University by Kevin McClure. He's at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And he also writes about many of the issues that I have observed and also, written about, especially how loyalty to higher ed institutions has really eroded since COVID-19. And then how more and more employees are leaving because they don't feel sufficiently cared for or supported. Um, is that something you're also hearing from your academic leader clients? And so maybe what are some common issues that you encounter in your work with
Yeah.
them?
You know, the entire caring and support of academic leaders, particularly department chairs, is something we've seen evolve a lot over time. I became a chair, it's been over, 2.5 decades, in the early 2000s. And at that time, when I became chair, there was some kind of a support system. There was maybe a half-day training. I remember being given a huge binder with policies and spreadsheets and do's and don'ts.
Which
And
I'm sure you read cover to cover, right?
absolutely, yeah, oh, you know what I mean very well, Tim. Um, and there was, it was useful. It was a good acknowledgement that you're now doing a new role. Um, but really, that was all there was, and then you sort of sink and swim. I have seen over the decades since then that institutions are placing more resources in department chair training. Sometimes it's a day-long workshop for new chairs. More and more campuses are now giving a year-long introduction or the cohort programming, which creates not just multiple opportunities to learn and share, but also builds peer groups and encourages peer coaching. So I'd like to think that institutions are doing a better job of it. That said, Tim, there's no doubt that in the decades since COVID, or not decades, in the years since COVID, the work of academic leaders has become immensely more complex, with more and more issues of compliance, and a whole host of issues that I never had to deal with back when I was department chair. That and the kind of struggle continues in many ways.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm really happy to hear that you have observed that there's definitely been a positive trend or trajectory in terms of leadership development for chairs. And really for those listeners and viewers who may not know this, I mean, the chair position, I would say together with the dean is probably one of the most complex ones because you
Yes.
face so many pressures from above and below, but it's also the entry level leadership
Yes.
position for many people. Some go into an associate chair position, but then the chairperson is the first one, and then eventually some of them move up. It's I'm so glad you brought this up because what has puzzled me since I started working in higher ed almost 20 years ago is how little leadership development or training for academic leaders I've observed. I'm sure some institutions are doing much better and some colleges do much better than others. You talked about core programs, peer groups, peer coaching. Again, it would be nice to have actual professional coaches part of that too, but that becomes a question of resources. It, some chairs are brilliant, as and the person I'm talking about. I worked uh, with an outstanding uh, department chair and leader who was just absolutely wonderful to work with. I learned a lot from him, and we've become very good friends. He's since moved up into a dean's position now. But these types of individuals really seem to be, let's say, the exception rather than the rule. Um, so I'm wondering, what are you seeing on the coaching side of developing academic leaders at the, let's say, entry level of academic leadership?
Yes. Um, Still a work in progress, I would say.
Mm,
The model in higher education um, has long been something we call mentoring as opposed to
mm,
coaching, whereas the corporate and private sectors have been in the world of coaching for a much longer. Higher ed is newer because of this inbuilt mentoring model, which is very common in guilds. I thought I spoke about faculty as a guild, where and mentoring is where more experienced members of the group support, provide advice, insight, their own experience to the more less experienced members of the group. So the mentoring model is very much more built in or baked in to the academic world. And the knowledge about coaching is less common. I am seeing more often now leaders, especially at the dean or more senior levels, being given or being supported with coaching in their first year. For new chairs, there was recently a conversation I had with a new chair who is not a client of mine, but just sort of called me for advice, and I asked him, have you considered, taking on a coach for your first year? And he said, "Oh, I have several senior faculty who are going to be good, who I'll be consulting with." So, as you can see, there's not a full understanding of
mhm.
this kind of having supportive mentors versus having a more formal coaching engagement. Uh, that said, I think there's a slow change here too. My own university from which I retired, I think showed great foresight in investing in an internal coach, and I was honored to play that role for 3 years, where it was an investment the university made that was available. That person was available to new chairs, new deans, new VPs, even. And I'd like to think that model will slowly build or and expand.
That is, that's really insightful. It's funny. I just this morning I actually posted a little blip on LinkedIn where I talked about being an internal change agent, which of course has its own challenges, right? Because you're part of the system that you're trying to change. But I think coaching really helps in that regard because it's so much less directive and really activates the knowledge and the skills and the strengths of your clients and kind of builds on that. So I think coaching is a really good way of doing that. But funny that your that this department chair that you spoke with mentioned, well, I have somebody I'm consulting with, So yes, so mentoring, consulting, coaching is of
Yes.
course three very, very different things. And I'm glad you pointed out that there was definitely some room for developing better understanding of what coaching actually is about. Um, as far as mentoring is concerned, I'm so glad you brought this up because, as you mentioned, it's obviously so much more widely established in fostering academic leadership. Uh, what I find interesting here is that the mentoring part probably is the biggest difference between faculty leadership development and staff leadership development, because in staff that those structures don't necessarily
Yes.
exist. In
Yeah.
faculty, they're very well, established. Now, what's for me is really fascinating thinking about mentoring, though, is that mentoring assumes that the experiences that the mentors share with their mentees are still actually valid
Relevant.
and relevant, right?
Yes.
Especially in this constantly shifting higher ed
Yes.
environment. And now you have a brand new generation of scholars and of faculty coming in. the overall environment is changing. Uh, so I think there are certain limits perhaps to mentoring where coaching might be better, or maybe taking a little bit of a consulting stance. So what do you say? How would you reconcile mentoring and coaching? Are they perhaps like two sides of the same coin?
Yeah, that's another terrific question. I think both of them are important, have important roles to play in for a new leader. I really see them in many ways. I see them as they are certainly two distinct approaches that may even have an overlap in some cases, but they're two distinct approaches. And the mentoring relationship can often, good mentoring relationships are often lifelong. And as you say, they involve an exchange of a more experienced colleague sharing how they tackled a situation, which can sometimes be problematic if the context has changed, but also really demonstrating building a caring relationship with the less experienced individual, and being there as a listener, perhaps providing tips. Sometimes good mentors will often be those that nominate you for or recommend you or speak to you for others. So there's sort of it's a broad package of support of someone who is occupying roles or in a discipline or whatever similar to what you're doing. The coaching engagement, as you know, is structurally different. It's usually time delimited. The coach may or may not be someone deeply embedded in the same context as the person being coached. And in the coaching relationship, I see it often as a much deeper dive into the coachee's discovery of their own potential and being able to access new approaches to solving what might seem as intractable problems and recognizing their own wisdom in dealing with them. I often liken coaching as the coach holding a sort of a giant mirror in front of the coachee, helping them to
Mm-hmm.
really see themselves as in a new way, uh, as opposed to really talking about themselves and their experience. And there's often an overlap indeed. And, since I am a coach and I've had a career in the higher education academic sector, sometimes I find myself switching roles.
Mm-hmm.
I do this very carefully, very sparingly, but it allows me to be in that sort of overlap space if I need to.
Yeah, I appreciate you explaining this, and especially that the fact that mentoring is so much more than just sharing advice and giving advice. And you you also mentioned the switching roles, and I think this is something that for leaders in particular is a super important skill to understand what the person you're working with needs at that moment. I
Yes.
mean, that's the kind of training I got in my agile coaching certification, because agile coaching, just even as the name says, doesn't just revolve around agile as a concept for project management and tackling change and doing work and developing product, but it's also this agility that we need to have as leaders to look at the person we're leading and said, what does that person need? Maybe the person needs some training. Maybe it's mentoring. Maybe there's we're working with a group. It's more of a facilitation thing. Could very much be a consultative approach, or then of course the coaching thing. And I love that analogy with the mirror. I would even say it's almost like a one-way mirror, because the
Yes.
coachee, they look at themselves, but you're also looking at your client
Yes.
through the mirror, so to speak. It's almost like a criminal interrogation there, and watch them attain more clarity about themselves. And I think coaching then also helps us step out of the advice trap, which I think is the big
Yes.
challenge in higher ed in particular, because being an effective coach in higher ed, you need to know something about the higher ed world. But if you are an expert in that field, it's easy to just want to start giving people advice, right? And that is of course a highly a highly dangerous thing. So I appreciate you bringing this up. Kavita, before we wrap, I would just love to for you to share just a few thoughts about the internal coaching experience, because you have the experience both as an internal coach and as an external coach working, with clients across the country. And maybe you can share a little bit about what that was like, what the advantages are, maybe what some of the pitfalls or traps are of being an internal coach.
Yeah, that is a really great question because it took me a while to get comfortable in that role. In some ways, COVID helped because I was working remotely and which is, I became an internal coach sort of in the early, around 2000, 2020, I mean, and I was not in the everyday meetings and so forth. So I was sort of physically removed. And in some sense, that created an internal external space. What I found was it was certainly easier to work with clients who I did not know, who had department chairs or deans or associate deans who had been hired in units that I'd not had prior interaction with. And that sort of allowed me to come in with some institutional context and knowledge, yet not be seen as someone that they didn't know and really could have been an external coach. The couple of moments of challenge that I faced was when I was coaching leaders with whom I had interacted with in prior roles.
Mm,
And there can be an awkwardness because in previous roles we might have been more of competitors, each one trying to advocate for their unit and not share anything behind the curtain, whereas in a coaching role that changes. And I'll be honest, I had some early missteps here where maybe as a coach, I came in perhaps with a sense of intimidation if the person was senior. What I realized as I matured into the role is the best thing to do is to put all this on the table. I mean, really have that initial conversation as how do you feel? We have had these interactions before. This is what, this is the prior relationships we come with. And now we're in a different role and really put on the table what some of these concerns may be. And I find doing that allows that to be addressed very quickly, and it actually helps build that level of trust, having that honesty up front.
that is super important what you just said, because also from a coaching mindset, we're always talking about partnering with a client. And I'm kind of glad that you also had that experience, because sometimes we do get intimidated when we work with somebody who's really high up in the hierarchy, especially if it's somebody you work with when you truly were a subordinate to that person.
Yes.
Um, and so the idea of partnering, of being at eye level, of being equals in this coaching relationship and supporting that person at the same, yeah, at the same level as where they are. That is so important, but it's also really intimidating sometimes and very difficult to make that shift. So thank you so much for sharing that. Kavita, our time is almost up, so I'm just wondering, any final words, any final thoughts you have before we wrap up?
Well, this is such a fertile territory. I feel we have, barely scratched the surface. And so it's because of that I'm so delighted that you are embarking on a, multi-episode series of coaching in higher ed because there is so much to discover. And I'll just add, Tim, I am seriously very grateful for you for opening up this knowledge about higher ed and higher ed coaching. And the need has never been greater with our context, economic, political, social, regulatory, the pressures on academic leaders, and we see this play out in the news every day, has never been greater, even though it might be cliche to say this. The work you're doing and what you're offering in terms of this agile coaching approach, I think has an important role to play in higher ed. So thank you for your work in this, and thank you for having me on today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for making the time to come on, Kavita. I truly appreciate it. And thank you all for watching this episode. I really appreciate you taking the time for that as well. If you've enjoyed this episode, please feel free to click like and to subscribe to the channel. Your support really means the world to us. You can also find more information about this program, about our guest, and the topic we discussed today at our companion site, higheredcoaching.us, as well as leadershipimagined.com/podcast. Thank you so much, and see you next time.